What you need to understand about the telecommunications crisis exploding across American digital infrastructure right now is that when Mark Carney publicly refused a $740 billion 5G infrastructure partnership yesterday, he wasn't rejecting telecommunications cooperation. He was announcing the end of American assumptions that Canadian telecom resources exist primarily to solve American connectivity failures. And when his response sent U.S. telecom giants into panic mode within hours, generating more industry upheaval than any spectrum auction in telecommunications history, it didn't just protect Canadian network sovereignty. It exposed the systematic collapse of American telecommunications planning and announced the beginning of a 5G era that operates without American infrastructure dominance. The shockwaves rippling through global telecommunications markets tonight aren't just about spectrum allocation or network deployment, though both of those problems are becoming catastrophic for American digital competitiveness. They're about the sudden realization that the world's most connected economy has allowed its telecommunications infrastructure to deteriorate so completely that it now depends on Canadian 5G expertise for basic network functionality. And Canada has just demonstrated that this dependency can be terminated with devastating effectiveness. I've spent decades watching American institutional capacity operate through frameworks that assume domestic telecommunications challenges could be managed through domestic technology solutions with international partnerships providing supplemental coverage rather than essential infrastructure capabilities. What we're seeing today represents the complete inversion of that framework, where American telecommunications policy has become so dysfunctional that Canadian alternatives aren't conveniences anymore. They're necessities that American institutional incompetence has just made impossible to access. The telecommunications crisis currently devastating American network infrastructure isn't just about coverage gaps or deployment delays, though both of those problems are catastrophic. It's about the end of American assumptions that 5G development is a domestic technology issue that can be managed through domestic institutions without regard for spectrum sovereignty principles or international telecommunications cooperation. And the panic spreading through American telecom boardrooms reveals just how completely those assumptions have collapsed. Let me walk you through what actually happened here, because the surface story completely misses the profound telecommunications dependency that this moment exposes for American 5G policy. Once you understand why American telecom giants were willing to offer 3 orders of $1 trillion for Canadian network assistance, and why Carney's refusal was so strategically devastating, you'll see why this decision may mark the beginning of a telecommunications crisis that American institutions are fundamentally incapable of addressing. The official version sounds almost reasonable until you examine the context. Facing unprecedented strain on American 5G deployment, escalating costs for spectrum infrastructure, and growing competitive pressure from telecommunications networks that can no longer match international connectivity standards. A consortium of major American telecom companies proposed what they called a North American 5G Infrastructure Alliance with Canada. The framework would have provided American telecommunications companies with subsidized access to Canadian spectrum management expertise, Canadian network deployment technology, and Canadian telecommunications infrastructure at rates significantly below what comparable services cost in international telecom markets. The deal was structured as emergency network assistance worth approximately $740 billion over 10 years. Essentially treating Canadian 5G capacity as life support for American telecommunications dysfunction. From the American perspective, this was technological leadership solving a technological crisis through continental cooperation. The logic was familiar. Canada benefits from American economic partnership. So pressure applied correctly would secure telecommunications assistance that American network infrastructure desperately needs at prices American companies can actually afford. The problem with that logic is that it assumes Canadian 5G capacity exists primarily to solve American telecommunications problems rather than serve Canadian digital sovereignty objectives. It assumes Canadian spectrum resources are available for American consumption regardless of Canadian connectivity priorities or telecommunications independence principles. And most catastrophically, It assumes that Canada has any obligation to subsidize the failures of American telecommunications policy through below access to network infrastructure that Canada developed while American 5G systems stagnated. When Carney was asked about the American 5G bailout proposal during a telecommunications conference in Toronto, his response was so direct and so strategically devastating that it immediately went viral across international telecommunications and technology communities. He didn't engage with the specifics of American network deployment needs. He didn't offer modified terms or suggest alternative telecommunications arrangements. Instead, he announced that Canada was implementing comprehensive telecommunications sovereignty protections that would prioritize Canadian network development, spectrum efficiency, and long-term international partners who contribute to global 5G advancement rather than seeking emergency bailouts for telecommunications systems they've failed to modernize. Then came the moment that sent American telecom stocks into freefall and triggered emergency board meetings across the telecommunications industry. When asked whether Canada might provide emergency spectrum assistance if American 5G needs became truly desperate, Carney delivered what may be the most devastating telecommunications assessment in modern digital history. Networks require investment, not bailouts. The phrase networks require investment, not bailouts, has now been viewed over 110 million times in the past 14 hours. It's been translated into dozens of languages, analyzed by telecommunications and technology policy experts around the world, and turned into digital infrastructure messaging that every serious telecommunications economy is studying for its implications about the future of American network leadership. But the viral moment wasn't just about telecommunications policy. It was about the institutional sophistication that made such confident spectrum sovereignty possible. You don't refuse $740 billion in potential telecommunications partnership revenue unless you have $740 billion worth of superior network alternatives already operational and 5G capabilities that matter more than short-term economic pressure. And Canada had been building those alternatives for years while American attention was focused elsewhere. Canadian 5G infrastructure development backed by government investment and rural connectivity principles has been creating telecommunications capacity that American network operators find more efficient and more comprehensive than comparable services available through American telecommunication systems constrained by regulatory capture and corporate profit maximization. Canadian spectrum management technology developed through partnerships with international standards organizations offers network optimization solutions that American telecommunications companies find superior to American alternatives, constrained by lobbying, influence, and technological stagnation that prevents long-term network planning. Canadian rural connectivity programs coordinated with Indigenous communities and remote economic development initiatives have been building telecommunications infrastructure that provides universal access through sustainable network deployment rather than cherry-picking profitable urban markets while abandoning rural connectivity. In other words, while American telecommunications policy was focused on maximizing corporate profits rather than network functionality, Canada was building comprehensive 5G infrastructure capacity based on universal access, technological innovation, and sustainable network development. When that capacity matured, American telecommunications dependency became strategically irrelevant. The immediate impact of Carney's refusal on American telecommunications planning has been catastrophic in ways that most Americans are only beginning to understand. Network deployment that American businesses depend on suddenly faces capacity constraints and technological limitations that threaten the competitive viability of companies that assumed reliable 5G connectivity would always be available. American telecommunications companies that have been operating with reduced network effectiveness discovered that Canadian alternatives they had been secretly relying on for advanced spectrum management were no longer available for American infrastructure expansion. Supply chain telecommunications networks that developed around access to Canadian 5G expertise are contracting as Canadian spectrum resources redirect toward partnerships that provide sustainable technological benefits rather than emergency assistance for American telecommunications. Incompetence. But the deeper crisis isn't operational, it's institutional. What the American 5G bailout proposal reveals is the extent to which American telecommunications functionality has become dependent on Canadian subsidization of American network failures through below-cost access to spectrum services that were never guaranteed as permanent policy. The institutional sophistication required to orchestrate this telecommunications sovereignty strategy demonstrates something that American network planners have consistently underestimated about Canadian 5G capacity. This wasn't a reactive decision triggered by specific American telecommunications demands. This was a proactive strategy designed to protect Canadian spectrum investment while demonstrating the inadequacy of American network crisis management. American intelligence services that failed to predict this telecommunications realignment face uncomfortable questions about their ability to assess network vulnerabilities created by domestic regulatory capture. When your analytical frameworks can't anticipate telecommunications policy changes that affect America's entire digital infrastructure strategy, your assessments of actual technology security threats become questionable. The constitutional implications reflect the same institutional inadequacy that has characterized American responses to telecommunications challenges throughout this crisis. When vital American network functionality requires telecommunication services from foreign spectrum systems that possess their own democratic legitimacy and connectivity priorities, the constitutional framework encounters challenges it wasn't designed to address through traditional mechanisms. The current telecommunications crisis can only be addressed through international cooperation with network partners who no longer consider American telecommunications dysfunction their responsibility to solve. When those partners have developed superior alternatives to American network partnership, constitutional tools designed to manage domestic challenges become irrelevant to international telecommunications problems. Carney's strategic genius becomes clear when you understand this moment as part of a comprehensive telecommunications realignment designed to demonstrate Canadian spectrum sovereignty while maintaining access to global 5G development through partnerships that prioritize universal access over profit maximization. The 5G rejection didn't just refuse American telecommunications assistance, it redefined the entire framework for international network cooperation. Instead of treating Canadian telecommunications infrastructure as American crisis management backup, Carney positioned Canadian spectrum resources as superior systems that serve universal connectivity principles. The broader demonstration effect extends far beyond North American telecommunications relationships. When a middle power country can successfully expose network vulnerabilities in the world's largest economy through spectrum sovereignty, every other telecommunications capable country begins reconsidering its own relationship with American network cooperation requests. European telecommunications companies have quietly begun exploring 5G cooperation frameworks with countries that demonstrate universal access investment. Asia network firms have accelerated development of telecommunications partnerships that don't require managing American regulatory dysfunction. This isn't anti-American telecommunications policy. This is rational network planning by countries that can no longer assume American telecommunications demands will remain technologically progressive across electoral cycles. When your most reliable telecommunications partner demonstrates that alternatives to American network crisis management are operationally superior, everyone else starts exploring what they might be capable of. The domestic political consequences for American telecommunications policy are particularly severe because communities most affected by Canadian 5G access termination provided the strongest support for deregulation policies that promised to enhance American network competitiveness while undermining the public investment that makes telecommunications sustainable. Rural communities that have depended on Canadian telecommunications expertise for connectivity are discovering that market-based network deployment cannot provide the universal access that public investment delivers. Technology-dependent businesses are facing network limitations that profit-maximizing American systems cannot address. From a strategic perspective, what's most troubling about this telecommunications crisis isn't the immediate network impact. Though that impact will reshape American technological competitiveness permanently, it's what this moment reveals about American institutional capacity to understand and respond to telecommunications challenges that require public investment rather than corporate profit maximization. When your approach to telecommunications policy is to treat network development as profit optimization rather than universal connectivity infrastructure, you're not building competitive advantages. You're advertising technological dysfunction while pretending to demonstrate efficiency. Leadership and dysfunction becomes visible. The moment international telecommunications planning prioritizes universal access over corporate profit maximization, the technology and connectivity dimension adds another layer of strategic significance that American telecommunications policy completely missed. Canadian 5G networks don't just provide connectivity. They demonstrate comprehensive telecommunications leadership that includes universal access and technological innovation necessary for sustainable digital infrastructure systems. Canadian investment in rural connectivity, universal access programs, and sustainable network development creates competitive advantages that translate directly into telecommunications partnerships. American telecommunications systems constrained by corporate capture and rural connectivity abandonment fell behind in network partnerships that matter to global 5G development. Looking forward, the most concerning aspect of this telecommunications crisis isn't the immediate network disruption. Though that disruption will reshape American digital leadership permanently, it's what this moment reveals about American institutional incapacity to adapt to telecommunications challenges that require public investment rather than corporate bailout accommodation. When network competitiveness becomes dependent on voluntary cooperation from telecommunications partners who have developed alternatives to profit-dependent systems, American policy tools designed for corporate accommodation become counterproductive. The more corporate subsidies America provides, the more attractive public investment alternatives become. Canada's telecommunications strategy demonstrates exactly this dynamic in action. Every American corporate telecommunications subsidy provided additional justification for Canadian officials to develop universal access programs. Every assumption of American network dominance created incentives for Canadian telecommunications independence. The viral response exploding across telecommunications markets tonight isn't just about network finance or 5G policy. It's about the recognition that spectrum sovereignty has permanently shifted away from countries that treat telecommunications as corporate profit opportunity toward countries that treat network infrastructure as universal access necessity. The path back to credible American telecommunications leadership won't come through louder demands for Canadian network bailouts or more creative threats against Canadian spectrum sovereignty. It will come through rebuilding the institutional competence that makes American telecommunications partnership accessible rather than extractive. That means network policies that prioritize universal access rather than profit maximization. It means telecommunications investment that addresses connectivity gaps directly rather than outsourcing network responsibility to foreign systems. Whether American political institutions can sustain that kind of fundamental telecommunications reform remains to be seen. Until American institutions can rebuild competent network policy, moments like this will repeat where U.S. assumptions of telecommunications dominance collide with Canada's commitment to sustainable infrastructure, revealing that raw connectivity demand is no substitute for strategic planning. The decision facing American telecom planners isn't whether to compete with Canadian 5G partnerships. They are already operational, already delivering services that U.S. systems can no longer match. The real choice is whether to reconstruct American telecommunications around universal access or resign to permanent disadvantage. History shows that spectrum advantages lost to corporate capture rather than earned through innovation are rarely regained. Canada's successful transition, which preserved universal access while asserting strategic autonomy, only underscores the scale of the American failure. The U.S. 5G bailout proposal was not merely a network request, it was an acknowledgement that American connectivity now depends on Canadian generosity rather than domestic capability. Carney's refusal was more than a rejection of aid. It was a bold declaration that spectrum sovereignty outweighs network convenience. The panic now rippling through American boardrooms should alarm every citizen reliant on stable connectivity. Networks designed for profit over access are inherently vulnerable, and sustainable systems can exploit that vulnerability simply by refusing to subsidize dysfunction. Canada's response did more than protect its spectrum. It announced the dawn of a new era in telecommunications, one where universal access and strategic sovereignty take precedence over corporate convenience, and where in 5G development, long-term connectivity matters far more than short-term profits.